Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Retro Shack. And if like me you're of a certain age where the stuff on this channel formed part of your growing up, you no doubt suffer from the same affliction that I do, that of the case of the two truths, the one in your mind and the actual one that is documented and, actually true. I think this is called the Mandela effect, and it's never hit me harder in the chops than with this little gem of a machine that we're looking at today, the Oric Atmos. Possibly one of the most beautiful little machines ever made. Let's take a look. Here at the Shack, we'd like to give a huge thank you to the sponsor for this video, PCBWay. They help us out with all of our PCB fabrication needs and make fantastic boards at amazingly competitive prices. And it's not only PCBs that are on the menu. Apart from other fabrication services like CNC machining, 3D printing, sheet metal fabrication and injection moulding, PCBWay also have a great projects library of cool stuff to build from people all around the world. Oh, and if you don't like waving a soldering iron about, they can even assemble your PCBs for you. That's the PCB way. Right, on with the show. Okay, so the truth in my head said that this was a French machine, most popular in France and with French people. But the real truth is that the company behind this little micro is well and truly British. The early days of computing was awash with tech companies named after fruit, like apple, apricot, pear, cherry, acorn, a nut is a fruit, I checked, and this has continued more recently, of course, with the likes of blackberry and raspberry. So, of course, back in 1979, when the very British sounding Dr. Paul Johnson, Mr. Mark Rayner and Mr. Nigel Penton Tilbury decided to form their own tech company, fruit was the way to go, and Tangerine Computer Systems was born to the world. Tangerine set up shop in Cambridgeshire, not far away from Sinclair Research, and although the British home computer market would soon be kicking off big style with the likes of the Acorn Atom and the Sinclair ZX80, the first fruit of the Tangerine tree was in fact a visual display unit, or VDU as they were known then. Any search for this VDU brought up the words much acclaim in the press, but no actual details or pictures. So here's an artist's mock-up of what it may have looked like. Only kidding, it looked more like this, but that's not the point. Let's spin forward a couple of years to 1982 and the launch of the ZX Spectrum and its practically instant success in the market caused Tangerine's backers to decide to create a subsidiary company called Oric Products International Limited, which isn't as fruity until you consider it as an acronym, OPIL, and that's only one letter away from opal, and opal fruits were definitely fruity. Bit of a reach? Probably, but in any case, Oric Products developed the Oric 1, which was introduced to the world in September of 1982, in time for the Christmas market, where it singularly failed to make a dent in the Spectrum sales. But then the Oric 1 didn't have an older sibling to pave the way for it like the Spectrum had with the ZX81. It wasn't hard to see at the time that Oric Products had the Spectrum firmly in their sights when you looked at the launch range, a 16K machine for £129 and a 48K version for £169, matching the 16K price and slightly beating the price of the 48K Sinclair machine. The 16K version fell to £99 pretty quickly, presumably because no one was buying them. I also remember popping into W.H. Smith's and doing the obligatory display of my programming prowess by looping some random rude word on the screen, and I remember thinking that the keyboard was terrible, as fiddly as my Spectrum keys and also hard and unforgiving, unlike my rubbery friend. I was not impressed. However, it seems a total of 210,000 other people were, as that's how many of them sold in the UK and France in 1983, enough to bring Oric Products International to the attention of a firm called Eden Springs Investments, who brought them and provided additional funding to launch the machine we're going to look at today. So in 1984, this machine hit the market, and it's a simply stunning looking unit. The mean and moody black case top with a fire engine red base and key accents just look so cool. And whilst the machine internally was 99.9% the same as its predecessor, the Oric 1, this machine had one major trick up its sleeve: a proper, full travel, nicely spaced, easy to type on keyboard. It really is one of the nicest keyboards I've used. Even the shift key is nicely placed for your pinky finger. Now, of course, Sinclair also released their own upgraded Spectrum in 1984, the Spectrum Plus, which also had an upgraded keyboard. But come on, Sinclair, you really missed a trick. This is how you address keyboard issues in your launch machines. But as we mentioned earlier, and like the Spectrum Plus, the Atmos was really just the previous model in a new case. So if you had the earlier model and, in quotes, upgraded, you quickly realised that a new look and feel was in fact all you got. Looking around the machine, we can see that it's all happening around the back. And here's another area where the Atmos beat out the Spectrum Plus: connectivity. Oric got it right first time with the Oric 1 and didn't change anything for this machine. We have, left to right, the TV RF out, RGB, cassette port, printer port, expansion port and the power input. No bare PCB edge connectors anywhere in sight. Now, with all of this comparison to the Spectrum, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Oric team were just copying the Spectrum completely and that the Atmos is effectively a clone. But apart from the striking looks, there's one very major difference between this unit and its Sinclair rival. But to see that, we have to take a look on the inside. Now, apart from the massive speaker which dominates the board, there are a couple of things that immediately stick out, one fairly obvious and one not so much. The obvious one is that there's an AY38912 programmable sound generator in here. That's the same chip we've seen many times before and has been around since 1978. It's found in many computers of the era and is something that the Spectrum wouldn't see until its first 128K incarnation in 1985. It was also in the Amstrad CPC range, MSX's, and in its YM2149F variant, it even made it into the 16-bit era in the Atari ST. Over here's the ROM, and space next to it for another one, more on that later. And here's the not so obvious: the CPU. It's not a Z80 like in the Spectrum, but a 1MHz 6502 by MOS Technologies, variants of which are found in the Apple I, the Commodore VIC-20 and C64, the Atari 8-bit home computer range and games consoles, the Acorn 8-bit range, and even the Nintendo Entertainment System, and, amazingly, the Tamagotchi digital pets. Now, of course, this made it machine code incompatible with Spectrum and Amstrad games, which would have to be completely rewritten to work on the Oric. Porting games from the C64 would also not be easy due to the Commodore machine's custom chips. Over here is the 6522 VIA or Versatile Interface Adapter, which is a companion chip to the 6502 and handles all of the input-output circuitry. This big beast is the ULA or Uncommitted Logic Array, and it's where most of the magic happens that makes this Oric an Oric. This chip handles all of the graphics and memory management and multiple other things that make the Oric tick. Over here we've got our RAM chips, and if you're being observant, you'll note that we have 8 Texas Instrument 4164 chips. They're 8K each, and 8 by 8K is 64K. But isn't this a 48K machine? Well, yes, but 16K of that memory was overlaid with the basic ROM. If you didn't need basic, you could disable the basic ROM and effectively give your program the full 64K. But if you disable the ROM, most of the core functions are no longer there for your program to use. If you want to see how it can be done, there's some interesting reading in one of the links in the description. Clever stuff. So that's what makes the Oric what it is. Let's take a look at how the machine manages to pull all of that together and just what made Oric Products International think they had a Spectrum killer on their hands. Now, as is often the case with these retro machines, someone out there has that magic mix of cleverness, resources, love for the machine and some time on their hands, and goes and creates a modern SD card based storage solution, and it's no different for the Oric. This is called the Error Bus, and it's a really elegant design. It has the SD card slot on the back, I've already put some Oric tape files on this SD card, and there's a handy reset switch here too, something that the Atmos didn't have as standard. Yes, we know the Spectrum Plus had one, and there's no additional power cable needed. The error bus simply plugs into the Oric's expansion port and you're good to go. Powering on the machine, we get a fairly typical screen for the period that tells us we're running Oric Extended Basic version 1.1, and other than cosmetics, this is the only difference between the Atmos and the Oric 1. The Atmos has the upgraded 1.1 ROM versus the original Oric's 1.0. And how much difference does the 0.1 make? Well, actually, quite a bit. Oric took the opportunity to fix a bunch of bugs in the original ROM, in particular around the cassette tape load and save routines. It was fairly common on the original Oric 1 to have typed in a huge program, saved it to tape, and then find that it wouldn't load back in. Very annoying. As well as this, the updated ROM shows the title of a file as it loads, and also if it's basic or machine code, and also added commands to verify that a saved file, was actually saved. Oric also curiously added a routine to join two programs together, but it didn't take into account clashing line numbers, so if you didn't plan for that and code each program in separate number blocks, they wouldn't join properly. There were a bunch of other basic commands added and general bugs squashed. As a result of this, some games written for the Oric 1 that perhaps used, avoided or even exploited some of those 1.0 curiosities just wouldn't work on the Atmos. Some games on cassette even came with an Oric 1 version on one side of the tape and an Atmos version on the other side. Remember that spare ROM socket we pointed out on the mainboard? Well, what some folks did was put the original 1.0 ROM in there and added an external switch so you could boot the Atmos up as its older brother if you had something that only worked on the Oric 1. There were some sound effects built into the basic, such as ping and explode, which helped to make your homegrown games sound a bit more polished. Whilst typing in the obligatory RetroShack rules, you know I have to do it, let's have a quick talk about the state of the Oric 1 software library, and this may also have given some indication as to why I thought initially this was a French machine. 30% of the 210,000 machines sold were sold in France, and a huge amount of titles were in French. Let's use the error bus to demonstrate this by issuing cload ... on the Oric, causing the error bus to leap into life and give us a list of Oric tape files on the SD card. Let's load Manic Miner, and the first words we see are in French, hence my confused brain. Anyone familiar with the Spectrum version of this game will immediately recognise that visually this is almost a direct copy of the Spectrum version, including the attribute clash, as the Oric also deals with graphics in a similar way to the Spectrum. A bitmap screen of on-off pixels and then an attribute map on top. Both the Oric and the Spectrum apply attributes of paper, the off pixels, and ink, the on pixels. The Spectrum does this in an 8x8 grid in a screen that is 32 characters across, 256 pixels, by 24 characters down, 192 pixels. The Oric used a 6x8 pixel character mode and had 40 characters across, 240 pixels, by 25 characters down, 200 pixels. So the Oric had less horizontal and more vertical pixels than the Spectrum. The Oric, however, was much more capable in how it applied its attributes, being able to assign ink and paper colours on a line-by-line basis, effectively giving a potential 16 colours per 6x8 block. Not many games use this level of attribute control as it was processor intensive, and we only had a 1MHz 6502 to play with and no fancy hardware sprites or custom graphics hardware. As we take a look at this fan-made conversion of Iridium for the Oric, we can see that the game is an odd mix of the Spectrum, Amstrad and C64 versions. Once it loads, it asks us to ensure that we've got the raster line in the right place, and this tells us we can expect some fancy attribute stuff, I guess. In reality though, that's limited to the top status display, which is nice and colourful, but we've got a decidedly specky looking main playfield. I definitely recommend downloading an Oric emulator and taking a look through the software library, as there are some real gems, and of course some real howlers. Lots of peripherals were promised for the Oric machines, but sadly they didn't make it to market before the company fell into a sackload of debt and eventually went the way of so many micro manufacturers in the 80s. If you've got an Oric, I definitely recommend the error bus, as it bypasses all of that potential cassette loading bugginess and is a lot quicker too. As a side bit of knowledge that no discerning nerd should ever be without, the Oric Atmos can be seen on a shelf in the IT crowd, or IT crowd depending on how you say it. And if it's good enough for Maurice Moss, it's good enough for me. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this little delve into the history of this lovely machine. Were you a proud owner of an Atmos, or did you just wish your parents had plumped for the Specky? Thanks for watching, and until next time on the Retro Shack, it's goodbye from me.